Hello, friends. I, Ankita Datta, project lead for the Mask series at www.tellmeyourstory.biz, welcome you to the sixth episode of the Mask Factor. I am privileged to have with us author Professor James Barilla this evening, and we are going to discuss a word, an era, a story, and the significance of them all. Tell Me Your Story calls for submissions of short stories and poems on Mask. Also, registrations are open for the writing program season 2 with the story prompt of Women's Silence, which is yet another form of Mask. Let me begin by introducing James. James Barilla is Associate Professor in the MFA program at the University of South Carolina, where he teaches creative nonfiction and environmental writing. He is the author of 3 books of narrative nonfiction about the human relationship with the natural world, including Naturebot, Unconventional Visions of Nature, My Backyard Jungle, and West with the Rise. Welcome, James.
Thank you, Ankita. Nice to meet you. And thanks for inviting me to be on the show.
Thank you, and same here. So hope you are doing well and that your loved ones are in best of spirits.
Yes.
Let's initiate this session by talking about the other side of the ongoing pandemic. So do you perceive that these insane times can heal the repeated scars etched on the environment?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. I mean, I think particularly early in the pandemic, my previous book was about the relationships that people have in cities with wildlife, and I think if you follow those kind of stories, you realize that in an urban context, the fact that everyone was kind of sheltering in place or staying indoors, wildlife, that was a dramatic change, not just for us humans, but also for wildlife that lives in the cities. And so you would find suddenly various species sort of venturing out into the streets in broad daylight that would never would previously have kind of hidden away. They were, in various contexts, but also a lot of species that sort of depended on tourists feeding them, or began to sort of be desperately sort of seeking food. So it really kind of changed the dynamics, I think, in that sense, and made people also. I think people had time to reflect more fully. I know that I had a lot more time to spend in the garden because I wasn't going anywhere. So I was creating all kinds of wildlife habitat in our yard, and I think a lot of people, at least around here, really invested a lot more time in their kind of own personal habitat, and I think wildlife benefited from that as well. Now, in a broader context, I do think that we've learned probably some important lessons that I hope will last, which is just in terms of maybe how much we consume and how much we actually need to consume, and really the impact, the sort of collective impact of that, ways that we can, be perfectly happy, maybe making do with less. So I think we saw the levels of CO2 and various pollutants decline, at least in certain places, as people were driving less. And it may be that, as we're doing now, meeting virtually, these have, at a collective level, an environmental impact. And I guess I'm hopeful that some of those will be lasting kind of lessons about how we can do better going forward in terms of our relationship with the environment.
Thank you, sir. I'm very curious to know, how is the daily life of a professor of environmental writing sketched? I mean, a professor who must be discipline bound and environment that is boundless.
Okay, yeah. Well, I teach creative writing and environmental writing. So I teach an environmental literature. So I have different kind of roles, you might say, that I play in the classroom, and different things that I teach. But I think for a professor like myself, I think the balance is always between the work that you're doing as a writer and researcher, and also the work that you're sort of teaching and sharing with people in the classroom. And so really, I think being a professor is about navigating those two kind of spheres. And for me, a lot of my work is inspired by going places. I write kind of narrative nonfiction, so I will, kind of engage with a story by going out and meeting people or seeing what's happening in various locations, and then trying to collect those experiences into a kind of central narrative. So what I'm often trying to balance is, kind of having time to venture out into the environment and go to the places where I see these issues kind of taking place. And my role on campus, which is to kind of be kind of invested in the classroom on a weekly basis. So I think that's really kind of the central, and I think that might be slightly different than a more traditional scholar who studies texts that are more something you can kind of go to the library and kind of do your research there. Mine is much more engaged with what's going on out there, and not just not just sort of in my immediate physical space, but globally, really. And so that's really the challenge that I kind of navigate is venturing out to various places, and also kind of bringing those stories back home.
Well, that already sounds fascinating. Uh, so, with the emerging trend of involving literature, with every aspect of environmental studies, what are your thoughts on literature evolving into the most necessary tool for portraying all the requisite environmental perspectives?
Okay, yeah. So I think that is something that I think a lot about in terms of the value of us telling these stories, particularly in terms of resilience. I think that my own hope in writing, implicitly, I think in writing my last two books, was really to sort of think about, okay, what is, given that we have this sort of prevailing narrative that we're struggling with, which is this climate emergency that we're all kind of dealing with. We're all sort of witnessing a growing sense of its impacts and menace. What can a kind of storyteller do in the midst of that and predicament? And so that's, I think, something that the stories that I think it's important to tell stories that have some sense of resilience, or that explore possibilities for hope and change within that context. So that's one of the reasons why I wanted to write about wildlife and people trying to coexist in cities, for example, because I thought, again, here is this place where it's one thing to sort of think abstractly about animals living and seeing them online. It's another when you're living kind of in the community with them and dealing with those kind of day-to-day challenges. It's not an easy relationship, but it's a sort of ongoing narrative that has possibilities for drama, but also possibilities for finding ways to coexist. So the same was true with my most recent book, in which I wanted to really think about whether the role of technology in creating kind of a hopeful future. What's the story? How do we relate to technology, particularly in terms of as a nature writer, or as a writer, someone who writes about the environment? There's a long-standing kind of, at least in the in American context, of antipathy towards technology and believing that technology is sort of antithetical to being out in nature. And so I wanted to, again, sort of explore the idea of, well, a lot of us live, we're communicating via technology right now. So, what is the relationship between those two forces, and how do we, how do we find stories that might offer more hope than this ongoing kind of conflict between these forces?
Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah.
So your book, Naturebot, is like a masquerade of the mimicry when
Yes.
technology mimics nature.
Right.
So this profound reference to masks compels me to ask you, if humans are masked enough, doesn't nature possess masks too?
Right. Interesting. Yeah. So I, I haven't given that question a lot of thought, but I think that what's interesting, I think, is to think about humans as part of nature, and then what is sort of natural for us. Are we do we, in essence, search for analogs in nature that we can then draw upon for our own creativity? Or what is the, kind of how is our own creativity, our own human creativity, sort of reflected in our technological creations, you might say. And so I see that as us creating. We might think of it as a mask of nature that renders our technology, that maybe renders our technology more familiar to us, maybe makes us more comfortable with it, or on the other hand, maybe makes us more uncomfortable with it. So there's various ways that I think our own human nature is reflected in the technology that we create. And the natural world then we're immersed in it, and at the same time we're sort of creating these imitations of it, these sort of masked technological creations. I mean, maybe a good example would be one of the chapters deals with the Impossible Burger, and it's the way that it mimics. They're trying to mimic various kinds of meat that taste like meat but are completely vegan, right? And so that whole notion of, well, wait a minute, why would we even go about doing that? I think is an interesting question to explore, right? Why would we even go in that direction? So I think questions like that, I think, are interesting in that kind of context.
Yes, absolutely. They're interesting. I mean, interesting from all sorts of aspects. So,
Yes.
yeah. So, in poetry, literature, and many other literary contexts, nature was often deemed to be a woman. So, at the time when such references were made, women were commonly considered the weaker sex. So, how do you look at such historical reference of powerhouses, being underestimated and finally leading to slow destruction?
Yeah. So I think that's again, I think you're right in sort of creating that kind of framework. And I if we look at the whole sort of trajectory of kind of eco-criticism and environmental literature, we sort of see that there's a sort of eco-feminist take on that trajectory, and both problematizing and sort of embracing that kind of connection, you might say, between femininity and nature. And I think at this point, what's interesting to me is to think about representations of nature in a kind of non-binary context. So to think about, well, what exactly are the terms of this engagement that are not sort of bifurcated at that level, but instead have these kind of multiple kind of dimensions, and how do we engage in those ways? So I think that is more along the lines of my how I might think about our engagement with the natural world as a collective series of terms of engagement, and really trying to think about ways that we don't assume the sort of validity of that narrative, that sort of established narrative, but instead kind of interrogate the ways that it might be refined or changed by a sense of various engagements in terms of gender and various ways that we engage with the natural world. So I think I would. I do think, however, that there is that we nevertheless have to sort of recognize the historical and ongoing kind of prevalence of that narrative, that sort of fundamental Mother Nature kind of narrative, and its ongoing kind of power, and to a degree the way that we continue to kind of marshal that power and that central narrative in order to try and create change or try and motivate people to do things differently, right? So it's not as if it's it's something that we necessarily want to just jettison entirely.
Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah.
So the book Naturebot paints new interdisciplinary lines between humanities and biomimetics and bioinspiration.
Yeah.
So if you could please elaborate the concepts and also allow me to ask you a follow-up question. Are these very infant strokes permanent and durable enough to stand the test of time?
Yeah. So, biomimicry and biomimetic, there's a constellation of kind of terms here that are used in different disciplines. And I tended toward biomimetics because I wanted to focus on a specific manifestation of this principle, which is technology inspired by nature, if we wanted to sort of summarize it briefly. But if we think about technology that's inspired by nature, what I really wanted to focus on was not kind of systemic kind of imitations, let's say, but more specific manifestations that really made us kind of look twice, think again about like, well, wait a minute, that's technology, but it's mimicking something that really raises questions for me about how I relate to the natural world. So I was interested in robots that look like that mimic the behaviors, abilities, and appearance of dogs, let's say, or seals, or various ways that, or even plants, right? So there's a way that you can think about the appearance of an object, a technological object, but also a way that if we, and this is more what the book is about, which is to think more about the ways that its behaviors, its abilities, its intrinsic kind of being is being sort of recognized and studied and transformed into a kind of algorithmic kind of pattern, and then manifested in a kind of technological representation. So something that mimics the natural original at that level. And so that was really, it was that translation process that really interested me. And I think that a lot of the laboratories that I visited have these kind of robotic creatures that are performing in various ways. A lot of those will never sort of emerge from the lab. I mean, I think they're sort of they're sort of thought projects, and they're not really meant to sort of be out on the streets yet, but several of them are. And I mentioned the Impossible Foods example. There are various, recently in New York City, that they tried trotting out some of the Boston Dynamics robo dogs that were meant to sort of patrol around, and people in the city just, I think, freaked out, and they withdrew these things because everyone was like, that's just so creepy. So we have this kind of reaction to the uncanny that's manifested by something that we know is technological, but nevertheless sort of seems to have these sort of properties that we associate with its natural kind of analog. And so that was what really interested me. I think a lot of these thought experiments may not directly appear kind of out there in that way, but I think it's an ongoing engagement, I think, with what it means to be natural and what it means to be technological. And coming away from the book, what it seemed to me was that there's an ongoing question of whether our technology kind of transcends the natural, or whether our technology is sort of ultimately, because of our own kind of physical embodiment, whether the things we create are intrinsically, ultimately kind of embedded in the natural world, and so in ways that are we can't really disconnect them very easily. So I think that, I think that's the sort of ongoing question is what will be the impact of some of these experiments as they sort of continue to evolve in the lab. So there's this sort of ongoing evolution that's happening between the various iterations of these creatures. And then the question becomes, well, what's their role in the world, and do we want them out there, and what are they meant to do? And we can see already, I think, the goal of something like Impossible Foods is to really sort of provide an alternative to conventional meat production, and already, at least in this country, you can buy that product in Burger King and various places. So you're already seeing a kind of impact, presumably.
Thank you, sir. We had already read about mechanical hounds when Bradbury wrote Fahrenheit 451. Yeah,
Right.
so
Yeah.
it's kind of relatable. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, so the various chapters of your book discuss varied facets of nature and human world. So, do the chapters gradually unfold an untold story as the reader passes the pages, or are they like individual dishes to relish?
Yes. Well, I actually had conceived of it as a nature walk, and so that's how I really wanted people to sort of encounter it. Was as if you were to take a nature walk, you kind of would go out on a walk in the forest, let's say, or somewhere in a national park or whatever it is. And along the way, you wouldn't really know what you were going to see. I mean, you might have some idea, but there would be these way stations, maybe with interpretive signs, and they would say, okay, so here you're looking at this vista, or you're seeing this creature, or this bird in the tree, whatever it is. And that was really the overall kind of conceptual model that I wanted the reader to sort of experience as they move through the chapter. So what that allowed for, that experience of a nature walk, allows for you to experience a variety of different possibilities within this ecosystem that you're walking through, and to get a sense overall of the ecosystem as a whole, rather than focusing on one particular creature and sort of delving into the minutia of that particular singular creature. Instead, what I was hoping to create was a sense of walking through an ecosystem and seeing various iterations of these different creatures as an overall kind of paradigm that has been around for a while, but I think is emerging into kind of the world more broadly at this point.
Thank you so much, sir. So, nature and man have a bridge, probably thought of as a trusted construction, which was eventually discovered faulty nonetheless. So, nature does try repairing the potholes time and again, but are we as humans capable enough to cope up with nature's subsequent and repetitive replenishing therapies?
Yes, I mean, I think that's an ongoing question. I certainly hope so. I hope that our own resilience matches that of the natural world. I think there's an ongoing tension between our own creativity and the pace of change in the natural world. I think that is, to me, a fundamentally unresolved question. Whether our own creativity and the pace of our own kind of evolutionary and creative change, and our need to kind of continually update and create new kind of expressions, how that engages with the pace of change in the natural world, I think is a fundamental kind of ongoing question. And one of the key questions, I think, is whether our own creativity ultimately transcends is a kind of transcendent force that transcends the kind of pace of change and pace of evolution in the natural world, and so then we become kind of distinct in a way from the natural world via our own creativity. I think that's an unresolved, to me, a kind of unresolved question, and one that I hope that our own creativity remains kind of in service to and in recognition of all the other kind of species that are sort of engaged in this community that we inhabit. And so my own hope is that our creativity is turned toward enriching those kind of possibilities, rather than in a kind of escape, kind of transcendent kind of mode.
Sure, sir. So, time will answer the question.
Okay. Yes.
So, your bio note on your website subtly mentions about your promotion of the Minibeast Habitats in
Yes,
urban schoolyards in England.
yes, right.
So, did your efforts serve your intended purpose of closing in on nature, on the humane, and on the bridge that we referred to earlier?
Yes, I mean, I think that that's an experience that I think informed my previous book, and that I've tried to um, really kind of manifest in our own kind of green space that we have around our house that I'm looking at right here, since we're sort of doing this at home. But yes, I think over time you sort of recognize both the limits of that effort and also the possibilities. So I think it's been several years now that I've been managing our yard instead of our garden as really a space for wildlife as well as us to enjoy, and a lot of different creatures have shown up that were not there. I think at the start they sort of discovered the space over time, and so I think walking out there now, you sort of see various creatures that you see them for the first time, or you see them kind of change in subtle ways, actually changing the habitat to a degree. And so I think it has made a difference on a local level. And I see, I talk with a number of our neighbors about what we're doing, what we're up to, because our garden doesn't look necessarily like a conventional suburban or urban yard. And so, I think to a degree, I've had a number of people ask me, sort of like, what should I plant, or how could I do this, or what are these plants that you have growing here, or those kind of questions that I think are useful. At the same time, I do think that when you start to confront something like the climate emergency, you realize this is sort of, it's a collective and planetary kind of question that we're confronting. And so you sort of realize, is it strictly, what else could I be doing? In other words, to confront something that feels to me less sort of tangible, less immediate to a degree in my own sort of individual circumstances. And yet I know at the same time that it's happening sort of pervasively at the global scale. And so how to engage with something that is that's planetary in nature, that requires sort of a collective effort, not just a kind of individual effort, but something that's collective, is something that I'm still kind of thinking about. And I think you get, to a degree, the answer, given my own kind of proclivities, I guess. I kind of come back to trying to tell stories and communicate these kind of stories that maybe inspire people beyond sort of my own neighborhood, to kind of do something, to think about issues, or to do something differently. And so that's where I've come to, at least at this point. It's sort of it's an ongoing question for me. How can I make a difference in the midst of this crisis that we're facing?
Absolutely, sir. That was wonderful. So,
Yeah.
the pandemic times are eventually going back to normalcy. At least there are efforts to do the same. So, to conclude the session, allow me to ask you, will the old times bring back the old treatment meted out to our dear nature? I mean, or have we become more aware since we were locked inside?
Yeah, I think to a degree, I think things are going to return, I think, in ways to what they were previously. And in fact, I think temporarily you might even see more kind of traffic on the roads and people out buying, this kind of buying spree, because we haven't been out. And, I can feel it myself, sort of like, I'm ready to get out there. My entire family, we're all ready to kind of go out. And because, for months and months and months, we literally were, we couldn't go to the store. We couldn't, we were very restricted. So I think everyone sort of collectively is feeling that. I do hope, though, that we also retain a sense of like, maybe I could kind of do without that. I kind of, that before the pandemic, I just sort of did this as a matter of course, but really I haven't missed it, and I don't need to kind of go back to that. And I think, I hope that there are a number of ways that we make permanent some of the environmental changes, and also look at the ways that we could actually extend or expand some of those possibilities to make them even more impactful. So I don't know the degree to which, for a long time, people were, the idea of telecommuting has been sort of out there, and everyone sort of thought, no, well, it's not, the time isn't ripe, and no one will kind of do that. And the pandemic has really kind of suggested, well, that's a reasonable possibility for a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people. And really, it was striking how much of an impact that made for a lot of people, in terms of just how much traffic was on the roads at various times. So just the degree to which we weren't producing as much carbon dioxide because we were not driving back and forth to work every day. It won't work for everybody, but I think, to me, that was a very striking and tangible example of something that we might be able to actually expand or build upon as these platforms get better for us to sort of communicate and use, and people become more familiar with them. Are there ways that we can that will sort of actually provide additional opportunities, rather than just returning to, okay, 8:15, time to jump in the car and drive for 45 minutes kind of thing. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. So
Yeah.
Let's hope for the best.
Yes.
So,
Right.
at Mask Factor, we are discussing whole new perspectives. So thanks a lot, James, and thank you for this very insightful conversation, and also for your time this evening and this morning.
Yes, thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me. Yeah. Go ahead.
Welcome, sir. And to everyone, let me put a reminder. Tell Me Your Story calls for submissions on Mask, and registrations are open for the writing program season 2 with the story prompt of Women's Silence, which is yet another form of Mask. We hope to hear from you. Till then, let us all try to stay well, stay safe, and though distanced, let us stay together. Good night.